Okay, so now we're moving on to trimming. So here's my bowl that is now leather hard. If it's bone dry, it's going to be very difficult to trim at this point. And if it's too wet, it's going to have a lot of burrs that will stick to the sides and make it difficult to trim. But what I'm looking at first is where my thickness is in my bowl. So I'm going to start to feel through here and say, okay, where does my thickness begin? So I'm going to mark that with my thumbnail here. And then I'll come up through the side. I know I've got a lot of clay right here that I'm going to be removing. And then kind of feel through the bottom of your pot and say, okay, how thick is this right here? If this is really thin, then you know you're not going to be able to take off a lot of material there. If you find you have something like a giant bump or something like that, or a flake of clay on the bottom of your piece, you can use your metal rib or rubber rib to recompress that and get rid of that so that's not in your way as you trim. So I know from feeling this bowl that I've got some thickness I can remove right here, some thickness I can remove right here, and I need to be a little careful in the very center. So I'm going to go ahead and get this centered on the wheel. So you can place it as close to the center as you can get it and have your finger nearby. Say, okay, well that's not quite centered yet. So I'm going to move it over. And as it's moving, you'll see that it's off center. And as it gets easier and easier about the distance between your finger and the pot, just slide it until you get it as close as you can. Nope, that's further away. Oh, that looks pretty good. See that? So now I'm ready to wad my piece down. Now, if you're learning how to tap to center, here's my pot. And what I'm going to do is keep my fingers really loose, my whole wrist very loose. And I'm going to tap this pot a little harder to get it to center with just this part of my fingers. You see how it's moving? Now, you see how it started to get closer to center. Now I'm going to just hit it more gently. I am not trying to time this. I'm not trying to hit it as it moves over to one side. I am just gently hitting it until you see it visually pop onto center. So harder at first to get it moving, and then as it gets closer, more and more gently until it's in the center. Okay, so now I've got some little wads of clay here. I'm going to hold the bottom of my pot flat, and I'm going to be pushing these down into the bat. I don't want to push them towards the pot, or else I could possibly crush the wall of my bowl, and I don't want that to happen. I've kept my wads kind of short so they don't get in my way as I trim this little bowl. Okay, so first up, I'm going to be removing this outside edge. Now, before I begin, I want you to see visually where this pot has its thickness. I don't want to trim it so that it has a foot that's as wide as this. It would look too visually heavy. So I'm actually going to be removing clay so that that foot ring is about this wide. And the reason why I'm selecting this width is because it's going to be used for daily use. So if I'm using it for ice cream or for my Cheerios, I want for that foot ring to be wide enough that a spoon can sit in it and the whole pot doesn't rock over. If it's a decorative bowl, you could go with a very tiny foot and put it up on a shelf and admire it that way. But if you're using it for functional pottery, you're going to want to have it a little wider than that, but not as wide as this because this visually looks heavy. So we're going to remove it to about there. And I'm going to mark this with my thumbnail first before I begin. So I've got my thickness marked out here and my foot ring marked here. I'm going to say, okay, my foot ring's going to be generally right about here. I'm going to remove all the material up to where I've marked it with my fingernails. You see how fast I picked that up? If I was tapping to center, it'd be much easier to get it back to center on the wheel so that when you go to trim it, it's not so much of a pain to recenter. Okay, I'm going to put my wads back on. So always hold your pot up at eye level to determine where your foot ring should be. And mark it with your nail, and then you've got some great information as you start to trim. So now I'm going to drag my fingers on my pot, and I'm going to be using my finger as a pivot point on this tool. And I'm going to be taking off all this big terrain out here to start. You really have to hang on to this tool overhand, nice and tight, because it's going to want to drag out of your hand. I have my elbows tucked into my body too, so that it doesn't pull out and pull forward on my arm. What's great about this tool is that you can use it to pivot from here to create that roundness on the outside of your bowl. I'm going to remove material right up to where I want my foot ring to be. So So that looks pretty good, except that there's a lot of clay right in here, and I want to get that out of there. So I'm going to switch tools and come over to my smaller trim tool. And you can see that this edge is flat and this one has more of a scooped edge on it. I don't use this edge very often because it really does remove too much material. I'm just going to use the flat side of this tool. Same hand position. Got my finger pivoting on here, and instead of coming in at an angle, I'm going to come in flat and push straight down. And what this is going to do is pop up your foot ring. There's my foot ring. I'm going to switch back to my larger trim tool, and I'm going to plane this just a little bit just to get that curve back in the pot. So I've just removed a lot of material out of this corner. Okay, now I'm ready for my foot ring. So I've got it marked in there. Now I'm going to be using the corner of this tool again, and I'm going to come in. You see I've got my hands braced together. Come in and establish your foot ring. Okay, so now I'm going to be removing material from the center out. Remember, if this is too thin, you don't want to trim a whole lot out of here. But you do want this to be domed up in this manner so that it matches the curve that's on the other side of the pot. So that you can imagine this whole bowl just being one big dome with this ring set on it. So it's going to continue this line up and over and out the other side. So I'm going to use the corner of my trim tool here, starting in the center. And just scoop out that clay right up to my foot ring. I can do that a couple of times, and then I can come back with the flat edge here. The reason why I don't use the flat edge first is it can drag it right out of your hand if it grabs, so I use it the corner first to just get the bulk of the clay removed, and then I come back to just plane this and smooth it out. So as I get to this corner, I'm going to start to tip this tool out a little bit because I know that this corner is going to have a little more clay in it because of the curve that's on the inside of the bowl. And I'm going to come in on the inside here, create this angle. Now, when you've got a pot that you've thrown on the wheel, you're not going to be removing clay from this flat area at all because you might accidentally go too deep and then your whole bowl is going to spin on this point. So at this point, as you're trimming your bowl, think about sharp edges. So this has a pretty sharp edge and this has a pretty sharp edge. And when you're using a bowl in the sink, it's in and out of the dishwasher, it's going to want to chip on these thinnest, sharpest points. So you're going to take those off. So I'm going to hold my tool overhand and just take off that angle and take off the angle here. I can run my finger over those angles to just soften them just a little bit. Okay, so now I've got a flat-edged foot ring here on the sides, and I want to give it a little bit more visual lift. So I'm going to come underneath this edge with my tool this way to create that angle. I'm going to come up underneath and create that nice angle. You'll see when I pick the pot up in a second the visual lift it creates. And I can come in with the flat edge too to remove any additional terrain that's there. And if that's leaving tool marks, come back with the large trim tool and do any finishing touches. If you have any lines, you see my little lines that are there, you can use your finger or your sponge to smooth those out. Okay, so now I'm going to pick this up and evaluate, okay, do I have any more thickness on this bowl? You see this curve that's happened here? That's what I'm looking for. I want it to mirror the curve on the inside. Do you see how my foot ring, if I turn it this way, how that angle makes a huge difference in the visual lift of that particular pot and makes it look like it's kind of floating off the table. You see this little angle that we created so that the pot doesn't chip? That will give it a tiny little shadow around the foot ring, which will make it look like it's levitating just a little bit. So there's all these little details that can help make your bowl visually beautiful. So just go through and feel and say, okay, do I have any more thickness I need to remove? And if you do, put it back on there, recenter, and take off a little bit more material if you need to. All right, that's it. Happy trimming.